top of mind for you? What is your biggest concern when it comes to Asia?
Well, my biggest short-term concern is that the dollar has weakened a lot this year, and we're right on a major support line. So if the dollar manages a counter-trend rally, then we should see some underperformance for Asian emerging markets. But if the dollar fails to rally and breaks below this support level, then I think the dollar goes significantly lower, and then I think we get another wave of money coming into Asia emerging markets. But my long-term view is that Asia emerging markets has begun a period of extended outperformance, and that period of outperformance began in beginning of 2016 when the sentiment of China peaked in terms of negative sentiment, when more than 50% of investors globally thought at the time the Chinese had lost control of the currency of the capital account. There's going to be a big devaluation.
Is that a global, re-inflation story and fundamentals, or is it about Asian central banks managing this inflow that's coming into Asia right now?
No, I think it's a fundamental reassessment that this is the best growth story in the world. But the point is, people were looking at a collapse in China. It hasn't happened. The Chinese are in control, much more in control of their currency capital account. Meanwhile, in terms of Chinese equities, and particularly we've had this very, I think, bullish more southbound flows from mainland China into Hong Kong equities. And that's a long-term story.
Now, as an equity strategist, you have to take into consideration geopolitics. What about North Korea and the pressure that's putting on the China-U.S. relationship?
No, yeah, North Korea is definitely the major geopolitical story in Asia this year. In my view, though, the reality is that North Korea has demonstrated its nuclear power. So actually, it's a matter of time, in my view, before the U.S. is forced to acknowledge that strategic reality that North Korea is a nuclear power. Once you acknowledge that North Korea is a nuclear power, then you can focus on policies of containment. So I would expect at some point in the next 6 months an admission from the U.S. that that's the reality. I would expect that statement to be coordinated with the Japanese, and then I would expect focus turning on how to contain North Korea and maybe have discussions with North Korea about ending, we're still formally in this period of hostility.
But is it enough to change your asset allocation for investors to reconsider what's going on?
No, that will just make people feel better about the region.
Okay.
But I'm overweight regardless of North Korea.
You really like India, and you continue to like India. Why?
No, I've been very overweight India since a few months before Mr. Modi got elected. I think Mr. Modi has implemented dramatic reforms in India. The one area he hasn't fully resolved yet is the banking system. But this demonetization move was extremely bullish for stocks geared to financial assets, like private sector banks, mutual fund companies, life insurance companies. So these sort of stocks are in my portfolio. In the short term, these stocks have gone ballistic. There's a huge domestic mutual fund boom in India. So in the short term, India is right at the top of the valuation range. But in a 10-year view, I think India remains the best equity story in Asia.
Investors seem to really have cooled on the U.S. story, especially with Fed tightening and also the Trump trade kind of diminishing. How does that story turn around for you? What needs to be the catalyst?
Well, what's interesting, right at the beginning of this year, there was huge belief in the Trumponomics trade. That belief has died, is dead. So actually, we can get a dollar rally if we suddenly get news flow suggesting that this whole Trump tax deal is going to be reactivated. So I would expect at some point in the next 3 to 4 months, market focus to return there. Because the Trump administration needs tax reform, as do the Republicans in Congress, because they've got midterm elections next year. But the key question is, how dramatic is the tax reform? The fourth quarter last year, we were looking at dramatic tax reform, border adjustment tax, corporate repatriation. So the question is the details. But I think what happens or doesn't happen on tax reform is much more important for markets than what the Fed does or doesn't do.
Well, before I let you go, I've got to ask you on behalf of the investor universe out there, what is the one thing that investors should be paying attention to that they're not right now?
No, if you're overweight Asia, which I think is the right call, the one thing that can go wrong from a global perspective is suddenly this whole Trumponomics trade's reactivated.